The wind hit like a freight train the moment Ethan Miller stepped outside the town limits. It was the kind of cold that didn't just sting your skin, it went straight through your bones. The old thermometer nailed to the fence post back by the general store had read minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit before the snow swallowed it whole. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around his 8-year-old sister Lily. She was small for her age, all elbows and thin wrists inside sleeves that used to belong to someone else's kid. Her scarf was wrapped up to her eyes, but he could still see them, wide, blue, and trusting. "Where are we going now?" Lily asked, her voice shaky but quiet, like she didn't want the storm to hear her. Ethan didn't answer right away. He didn't have one. Behind them, the lights of the town were already fading into the white blur. A few hours earlier, they had stood in front of the council hall, listening to grown men talk about them, like they weren't even there. "Two mouths too many, no parents, no land, no work. We can't feed them through winter," someone had said. "They'll die anyway if they stay," another voice added. Ethan had held Lily's hands so tight she almost cried. Their mother had been buried the previous spring, their father the winter before that. Since then, they'd been moving from barn to barn, shed to shed, until even that ran out. Now they had a backpack, a blanket, a rusty hunting knife, and a dog named Scout who trotted behind them with ice clinging to his whiskers. The sky was low and gray, heavy like it wanted to crush the land flat. Snow blew sideways, erasing the road as fast as their boots made tracks. Ethan's legs burned. His chest felt raw every time he breathed, but he kept walking. Because Lily was still walking. She slipped once, and he caught her before she hit the ground. Her hands were trembling inside her gloves. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" he said. "For being slow." Ethan knelt in the snow in front of her, ignoring how fast the cold soaked into his jeans. He brushed snow off her boots with his bare hands. "You're not slow," he said. "You're strong. You've been walking for miles in a storm that scares grown men." Lily tried to smile. It came out crooked. Their father's voice echoed in Ethan's head, like it had been waiting for this moment. "If the wind ever turns deadly, don't fight the sky. Find the earth. Caves hold warmth. Stone remembers heat." Back when their dad was alive, he used to point to the limestone bluffs outside town and say they were safer than any house in a real blizzard. Ethan had thought it was just another story. Now it was all he had. He looked toward the dark shapes rising through the snow, jagged cliffs half hidden by drifts. "There are caves out there," he said. "We can make it if we keep moving." Lily's teeth chattered. "Are you sure?" "No," Ethan admitted. Then he stood and took her hand again. "But I'm sure we can't go back." Scout barked once, low and sharp, like he agreed. They turned away from the town for good and headed into the storm. Two kids and a dog walking straight into the white silence, carrying nothing but a half-remembered lesson and the stubborn hope that the earth itself might still have room for them. By the time Ethan saw the first dark opening in the bluff, his eyelashes were crusted with ice and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. The wind shoved at their backs like it was trying to knock them off the face of the earth. "There," he said, pointing. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin, exhausted. Lily squinted through the blowing snow. "Is that a hole?" "It's a cave," Ethan said. "Dad said these rocks are full of them." They reached it just as Lily's knees started to buckle. Scout darted ahead, barking once before disappearing into the darkness. That was enough for Ethan. If the dog went in, they were going in too. Inside, the world changed. The wind dropped to a whisper. The air still bit with cold, but it wasn't the sharp, slicing cold of outside. It felt held, protected. The cave sloped downward and widened into a rough chamber where the stone ceiling rose high above them like the inside of a church. Lily sank onto a rock, breathing in shaky gasps. "It's quiet," she said. Ethan dropped the backpack and leaned against the wall, his heart hammering. For the first time since leaving town, he wasn't fighting the storm. The stone itself stood between them and the sky. Then he heard it. Water. A soft, steady sound echoing from deeper inside the cave. "Stay here," he told Lily. "I'll look." He found a shallow underground pool fed by a narrow stream slipping out from the rock. The water moved slowly, never freezing. Pale shapes slid beneath the surface. "Fish," he whispered, "real ones." When he came back, Lily was rubbing Scout's ears with stiff fingers. "There's water," Ethan said, "and fish." Her eyes widened. "Like food fish? Like dinner fish?" They didn't celebrate. They were too tired, too cold, too aware that surviving one night didn't mean surviving the winter. Ethan worked while Lily rested. He dragged fallen branches from just outside the cave and leaned them against a natural rock wall to make a windbreak. He used the torn tarp from their pack to cover gaps and piled stones at the base to keep it from flapping. When he finally struck a spark and coaxed a small fire into life, Lily clapped her hands weakly. "It's like a house, Ring," she said. "It's not a house," Ethan said, then corrected himself. "Not yet." The next day, snow sealed the cave entrance halfway shut. They could still get out, but the wind couldn't rush in anymore. Ethan realized something important then. The cave was holding its own temperature. It didn't care how angry the sky became. He remembered another piece of his father's advice. Build inside the shelter, never right at the mouth. So he did. Using dead wood and flat stones, he framed a small cabin shape inside the cave, just big enough for 2 kids and a dog. Lily helped by handing him branches and packing mud into cracks with her mittened hands. "People are going to laugh at us," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. People already did. On the third day, a pair of hunters passed by and saw smoke drifting from the cave. One of them snorted. "You kids living in a hole now?" "Better than freezing in a house," Ethan said. They shook their heads. "You're digging your own grave." That night, Lily curled up in their half-built shelter, wrapped in the blanket in Scout's fur. "Do you think they're right?" she asked. Ethan stared at the fire, its light dancing across the stone walls. His fear was real, so was his resolve. "No," he said. "I think they forgot how to listen to the land." Outside, the blizzard howled louder than before. Inside, 2 children and a dog sat in a cave that felt strangely alive, waiting to see if a place everyone called a tomb might turn out to be something else entirely. The blizzard didn't end. It deepened. By the 5th day, the sky looked like dirty cotton, and the wind screamed nonstop across the prairie. Snow buried fences, swallowed roads, and turned barns into white mounds. In town, chimneys clogged with ice. Stoves went cold. Horses froze where they stood. Inside the cave, time moved differently. Ethan woke every morning to the same steady quiet. No whistling wind, no shaking walls, just the crackle of a small fire and the slow drip of water from the stone ceiling. Their little cabin, 4 rough walls built inside the cave, was holding heat better than he dared hope. The rock around them felt cool but not deadly. It felt patient. Lily learned the cave by heart. She knew where the light fell from the narrow crack in the ceiling. She knew which stones near the pool were safest to step on. She named the stream Silverline because it shimmered when the firelight touched it. Ethan made a fishing line from thread pulled out of the blanket and a hook carved from a bent nail he found near the cave mouth. It took him 2 hours to catch the first fish. When he finally did, Lily gasped like he'd pulled treasure from the water. "We're not going to starve," she said. "Not today," he replied. But outside, the world was unraveling. On the 7th night, they heard voices echo faintly through the cave entrance, shouts swallowed by wind. Ethan froze with the knife in his hand. Scout lifted his head and growled low. Footsteps stumbled near the mouth of the cave. A lantern flickered once and went dark. Someone coughed. "Hello?" a man called weakly. "Anybody in there?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought of the town hall, the way those men had looked past them, the way the door had closed. Lily stood up slowly and walked to his side. Her face was pale but steady. "They're cold," she whispered. "I know. They don't sound mean now." Ethan walked to the cave opening. Snow rushed in like a living thing when he pulled back the tarp. 3 figures stood there, bent and shaking. A woman with a baby wrapped inside her coat. An older man with frostbitten fingers. A teenage boy whose lips were blue. "We heard about the smoke," the man said. "We thought you were crazy, but we don't have anywhere else." Ethan hesitated. Behind him, the fire popped. The stream whispered. Their small shelter glowed like a hidden heart in the stone. "You can come in," he said, "but you have to listen to me." They stared at him. "Sit near the fire, don't touch the walls, eat slow, and nobody panics." The woman started crying before she even stepped inside. Word spread fast. The next day, more came. A family of 4 whose roof collapsed under snow. A farmer who lost his cattle and walked 2 miles with no gloves. A man who used to laugh when he saw the kids hauling wood. By the 3rd day, the cave was full of breathing bodies and trembling voices. 23 people. The small cabin that once held 2 children now held a village. Ethan organized them the only way he knew how, like chores on a farm. 2 people fished. 2 gathered wood from fallen trees near the bluff. One kept the fire alive. One stood watch near the entrance. Lily took care of the younger kids. She showed them how to sit close without pushing, how to hold their hands near the warmth, how to wait their turn for food. You don't rush the fish, she told a little boy. They don't like hurry. That night, the wind roared so loud it felt like the sky was tearing itself apart. And inside the cave, surrounded by people who once turned them away, Ethan and Lily stayed awake by the fire, listening to the storm try and fail to break through the stone. By the fourth night, the cave no longer sounded empty. It breathed with people. Coughs echoed softly against the stone. A baby whimpered in its sleep. Someone whispered prayers near the fire. Outside, the blizzard screamed like it wanted inside. But the rock held firm, thick and unyielding. Ethan barely slept. He kept counting. The woodpile, the fish, the faces. 23 of them now. Some were strangers. Some were the same folks who'd shaken their heads when he and Lily first dragged branches into the cave. One man couldn't meet Ethan's eyes at all. He just stared at the fire like it might judge him. The woman who had arrived with the baby, her name was Martha, sat hunched against the wall, breathing too fast. "It's early," she said, voice tight. "I wasn't supposed to have the baby yet." Lily sat beside her and held her hand. "You're warm now," she said softly. "My brother says warm is the most important thing." Martha tried to smile. The storm worsened. Wind slammed into the bluff so hard that fine snow worked its way through tiny cracks. Temperatures plunged again. No one knew how cold it was outside anymore. All they knew was that the fire burned blue at the base, and breath hung in the air like ghosts. Near midnight, Martha cried out. Not from fear, from pain. Ethan looked up, heart hammering. "What's wrong?" "I think it's happening." Panic rose like a wave. They had food, they had shelter, they did not have a doctor. An older woman named Mrs. Alvarez pushed her way forward. "I've delivered 3 babies in my life," she said. "We need clean water, blankets, space." The cave shifted from refuge to emergency room. 2 men carried Martha closer to the fire. Lily helped tear cloth into strips with shaking hands. Someone boiled water in a tin pot balanced on stones. Ethan stood frozen for a second, then forced himself to move. "Keep the fire steady," he told the others. "Not too big, not too small, and nobody crowd her." The labor lasted hours. Outside, the storm howled like it wanted to rip the world apart. Inside, a woman fought to bring life into it. Lily sat with the other children near the back of the cave. Scout pressed against her legs. She covered her ears when Martha screamed, then uncovered them again because she didn't want to be afraid. "Is she going to die?" a little boy whispered. Lily shook her head. "My brother says the cave keeps people alive." Just before dawn, a new sound cut through the wind. A cry, thin, sharp, alive. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed. Someone sobbed. Someone said, "Thank God," over and over like it was the only sentence left in them. Mrs. Alvarez lifted the baby into the firelight. "It's a girl." Martha named her Hope. Not because the name was pretty, because it was true. The cave changed after that. It was no longer just a place to hide. It became a place to hold on. People shared what little they had. Coats became blankets. Blankets became walls. Strangers passed food to strangers without asking whose turn it was. One night, the man who had laughed at Ethan weeks earlier stepped forward. "I said you were digging a grave," he muttered. "Guess I was wrong." Ethan looked at the baby sleeping in Martha's arms. "We all were," he said. "They stayed like that for days. Wind, snow, darkness. Light from the fire. Fish from the stream. Stories whispered in the dark. And every time the storm tried to force its way inside, the stone answered first. Not with sound, with stillness. 2 children had built a shelter to save themselves. Without meaning to, they had built one for everyone else. And somewhere in the roaring cold outside, the blizzard was losing. On the 9th morning, the cave woke to silence. Not the heavy, frightening silence of fear, but the soft kind that comes after something terrible has passed. The wind was gone. The fire burned low and steady. No snow rattled against the stone. Ethan was the first to reach the entrance. He pulled aside the tarp and squinted into a world that looked brand new and broken at the same time. Snow lay piled higher than fences. Drifts climbed halfway up the bluffs. Trees leaned at crooked angles like they were too tired to stand. Far in the distance, smoke rose from one chimney still standing. Behind him, people gathered quietly. No one rushed out. They had all learned what rushing could cost. "They're gone," someone whispered. "The storm's gone." One by one, they stepped outside, boots crunching into snow that hadn't been touched in days. Faces turned toward the pale winter sun like flowers. They learned later what had happened beyond the cave. Houses had collapsed. Livestock had frozen in place. Entire families had been found locked inside their homes, waiting for warmth that never came. 27 people in the county didn't survive the blizzard. But every single person who made it to the cave did. All 23 of them. Hope slept in her mother's arms, wrapped in a coat that had once belonged to a stranger. She had been born while the world was trying to die, and she had won. The man who once laughed at Ethan walked up slowly and stopped in front of him. "I don't know how to say this," he said, voice rough, "but you saved us." Ethan shook his head. "The cave did." The man looked around at the stone walls, the blackened fire pit, the narrow stream still running clear. "Then you listened when the rest of us didn't." Lily stood beside her brother, holding Scout's collar. Her face was thin, but her eyes were bright. "We just didn't want to disappear," she said. After the snow melted, the town rebuilt. But it rebuilt differently. People stopped laughing at the bluff. They started studying it. Ethan showed them how to build inside the rock, how to block the wind, how to use the ground's steady warmth instead of fighting the sky. Small cave cabins began to appear along the ridge, one by one, simple, stubborn shelters that remembered what the storm had taught them. Lily went back to school that spring. Years later, she became a teacher. And every winter, when the wind howled outside her classroom windows, she told her students about the cave, not as a miracle, as a lesson. "Home isn't just wood and nail," she would say. "Home is knowing how to survive and who to survive with." The cave still stands. So does the story. 2 children were banished into a blizzard. They built a shelter to save themselves, and without meaning to, they saved 23 lives. So here's the question for you. If you had been in that town, cold, afraid, and running out of time, would you have followed 2 children into a cave? Or would you have stayed where everyone else stayed? And if you were Ethan, would you have opened the door to people who once turned you away? Let us know what you would have done in the comments. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about survival and kindness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true style stories about courage, resilience, and the unexpected places where hope is born. Because sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones who end up saving everyone.